Nader Hashemi is an associate professor of Middle East politics at Georgetown University. He joins me now from Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for being with us. So first of all, if this does happen, how significant is this?
Well, obviously, it would be significant given the tragedy and the horror show that we've been seeing in Gaza since October the 7th. We're talking about 400,000 people who the UN is saying is on the verge of starvation. Um, there's a tremendous amount of suffering, the entire collapse of the healthcare sector. 1.5 million Palestinians in Gaza, lined up against the Egyptian border, waiting for an Israeli onslaught. So any reprieve in those that would alleviate these dire conditions that the World Court has ruled as a plausible case of genocide, obviously will be a step in the right direction. I'm somewhat skeptical that we're going to get to the pause that President Biden is talking about, in large part because President Biden, right from the beginning of this conflict on October the 7th, has allowed Benjamin Netanyahu to determine the pace of this entire crisis. And so he's unwilling and seemingly unable to try and press the Israeli prime minister to observe a ceasefire. So really, I think we have to wait and see what Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet decide. This is really not in Joe Biden's hands at all.
Yeah, I mean, what is behind the decision by, or the intentions by the Israeli president to push ahead, Israeli prime minister rather, to push ahead with this attack on Rafah, which he says is going to happen with or without a ceasefire?
Well, ostensibly, it's to try and root out Hamas, which is one of Israel's war aims. But I think there's, a deeper push here by the right-wing cabinet ministers and also Netanyahu, who's had longstanding desires to, rid Israel of its Palestine problem and getting rid of the Palestinians, perhaps pushing them across the border. I think that's very much in the cards. And, anyone who's been following this crisis since October the 7th can see, senior Israeli leaders right down the line openly saying that the Palestinians, should leave, other countries should come and take them. There's a deep desire to sort of, have that as possible a war aim here. And, a few days ago, Benjamin Netanyahu laid out his vision for a post Gaza war situation. It looks very much like an ongoing colonial occupation to me. So I think that's the perspective of the Israeli prime minister. He is under pressure domestically. I suspect also Israel's war in Gaza is not going the way Israel expected. Most of Israel's wars are very short and very quick. Now we're approaching the fifth month of this war, and so I suspect Israel is probably bogged down, not knowing what to do. So perhaps some temporary pause might work in Netanyahu's interest. But the key issue here, we have to remember, it's only temporary because, much remains to be resolved here in terms of the underlying roots of this crisis and whether any Palestinians can actually go back to their homes, given the level of devastation that we've seen in Gaza since October the 7th.
You talk there about the domestic pressure that the Israeli prime minister is getting. There is also a level of domestic backlash that the U.S. president is dealing with as well back home, not the least of which is from elements of his Democratic Party, many younger people in the United States who are appalled by what's happening in Gaza. How much of a factor is all of this in Biden's calculations, particularly given the fact that this is an election year?
I think it's a big factor. It's not a coincidence that tomorrow in the state of Michigan, where there's a large Arab and Muslim population, you're going to have the Democratic primaries. And Biden has made this announcement a day before, perhaps thinking that this is going to help him tomorrow when people go cast their ballot for the nominee for the Democratic Party. It could be very embarrassing if that result shows widespread disillusionment for the president of the United States. It certainly doesn't help him in this election campaign. So the timing of his statement today and what's happening tomorrow in Michigan, I think, is noteworthy. But yes, broadly, what you've stated is absolutely a factor. I think that's affecting Biden's calculation. Biden has his claim to fame, or at least his claim to appeal to Americans, particularly younger voters, is that he's very different than Donald Trump morally and politically. But when you look at Biden's Gaza policy, there's no moral difference there. Biden looks very bad. He's basically presiding over a plausible genocide. So how does that help him politically with younger voters who are, disillusioned with the American political process to begin with? And then against the backdrop of Gaza, there's not a lot of, moral distinction that one can see between Joe Biden and what he represents and what he's actually done. And then the other candidate, Donald Trump, who, looks very much like Biden when it comes to basic questions of, ethics and values.
Good to get your perspective, Nader Hashemi. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.